Hi, and welcome to Tom Kennedy Science, and I'm your host, Dr. Tom Kennedy. Today, we're going to talk about evolution by natural selection. It is the central paradigm to all of biology, after all. And I love this photo of this hummingbird. Yeah, I took it. It managed to sit there and hover forever right in front of the bird feeder, so I was able to get a fairly decent photo of it. I don't often get good photos of hummingbirds, but that's a male broad-tailed hummingbird here in New Mexico. So what's our learning objective? How about explaining how Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection explains the unity and diversity of life? Now don't worry, I'll explain how natural selection works and Darwin's contribution to evolution in terms of this unity and diversity of life. Now wait a second, unity and diversity of life? What could I mean by that? Let's take a look at these organisms. I've got a pelican on the left. The thing on the bottom, in the middle, what in the world? That's actually a bay scallop. A scallop, it's a mollusk, right? Specifically, it's a bivalve. And those little blue dots, those are eyes. And I took that photo on my mom's dining room table. Yes, I turned it into a photo studio with live animals in water. Yes, my mom was nervous that I was going to ruin her table. But let's get back. We also have got some fungus up there and some plants. That is an incredibly diverse array of life. Well, they're all multicellular life. They're all eukaryotes. But think about that. A bird, a mollusk, a plant, and a fungus. We haven't shared common ancestors in hundreds of millions of years. So there's a lot of diversity there. But there's a lot of unity, right? There's a lot of unity. We're all multicellular organisms. We do chemical signaling to communicate with all of our cells. We all make ATP using mitochondria. So there's lots of similarities. So how do you have all of these similarities across all life, yet how do you have diversity? Well, it turns out that Darwin explained that in his theory of evolution by natural selection. Now, don't forget, Darwin is not the only person to come up with the theory of evolution by natural selection. There's another one, A.R. Wallace. This guy was an amazing naturalist. He has quite a life story. He started out in South America making collections. He spent 2 years collecting, and his brother came to join him, and believe it or not, his brother died after going back home. Then he had 2 years of specimens, and he had a riverboat accident, lost about half of his specimens. Then he gets down to the port city to hop a boat back to England, and he gets on the wrong boat. It burns up at sea. He floats out on the ocean for 11 days with the crew, bailing water the entire time. And another ship finally came and picked him back up and took him back to England. And he wasn't there for long. He found himself in Indonesia, where he was studying all kinds of animal life there and sending and selling specimens back to fund himself. See, unlike Darwin, Darwin came from money. He was self-funded. Wallace actually had to sell specimens to rich people to fund himself. So he was a commoner. And then he gets malaria. And then he sits in a lodge with his fever. And he writes out like the theory of evolution by natural selection. And then he sends it to Darwin. So Darwin gets this in 1858. Darwin is 49 years old. And he's like, wait, this guy basically has my theory. So Darwin took his and Wallace's theory to the Royal Society and presented both of them. And then in 1859, Darwin published On the Origin of Species. It only took him a year to write it. 500 pages, but it included a lifetime of work that he spent amassing evidence for evolution by natural selection. So let's talk about it. Before I get into natural selection, we sometimes forget that one of the biggest contributions that Darwin made is that he proposed the species change over time, and natural selection is the mechanism of that change. So here's an example. This is whale evolution. Whales were once land animals, or at least their ancestors were once land animals about 65 million years ago. And then over time, they moved in the water, they evolved, and they grew larger and larger and larger and larger. And today we have lots of different types of whales, and they're broadly classified in two groups. The baleen whales, they have baleen, right? They're filter feeders. So think humpback and great blue whale. And then there are the toothed whales. Think sperm whale, killer whale, and all your dolphins. Those would be the other major lineage. So this is important. Species are changing over time, but Darwin proposed that all species are related by common ancestry. That was an enormous contribution. So often gets overlooked of how important this contribution is, because if you're evolving from common ancestors, then you share traits of that ancestor. If you're closely related, you had a recent common ancestor. If you were more distantly related, you might share fewer traits in common. But that explains this unity and diversity of life. And this is what we call a phylogenetic tree. It shows relationships. And the common ancestors are at the points. And then you can see the little line where it says bony skeleton. So you are more closely related to a salmon than a salmon is to a shark. I know it's weird, I promise you. I know the shark is right next to the ray-finned fish, but you got to look at the node. See, with a bony fish, you and I share calcified. We share osteocytes. Those are cells that produce bone, mineralized bone. So there you have it. So that's our common ancestry here. So as we descend from these common ancestors, we share these traits in common. You'll also notice there's a crocodile. It's right next to a bird. That is correct. Birds are more closely related to crocodiles than a crocodile is to a lizard. And they're both actually related to dinosaurs. They're called archosaurs. Yep, birds and crocodiles and dinosaurs, archosaurs, means ruling lizard. And these also show these evolutionary innovations. So 4 limbs, that's you, me, reptiles, amphibians, and birds. We're tetrapods. We got 4 limbs. Tetra means 4, pod means foot. So here's the descent with modification. As species change over time, there's this passing of traits from parent to offspring, and there's small changes that occur each generation, and over time these species change. Now, of course, Darwin, he predicted in the 1859 that if you're changing over time, you're going to find these transitional fossils. And in 1859, they didn't know of any, but guess what? In Hamburg, Germany, in 1861, they found Archaeopteryx. Archeo means old, pteryx means winged. This means old winged. And here is this transitional organism. It flew like a bird. It had feathers, but it had little claws on the end of its wings. It had teeth and a bony tail. So it had characteristics of both dinosaurs and birds. There's your transitional organism. So Darwin is realizing, that species are changing over time. Now, here's where we have the theory part. Now, in a previous video, I've done, evolution's a fact and a theory. Species change over time. That is a fact. We can observe it. We can measure it. We can test it. It actually happens. It's verifiable. The theory part of evolution is natural selection. Here's the mechanism that causes species to change over time. So Darwin and Wallace, they said that natural selection is the differential survival and reproduction of individuals in a population. Differential survival. I know that's a weird way of saying, or a more complex way of saying, hey, life and death are not random. And there's a cheetah eating a Thompson's gazelle. I saw that happen. It was pretty amazing. This lone Thompson's gazelle just kind of pops up on the horizon, and these 3 cheetahs look at it, and within about 30 seconds, the outcome was known. There it is. So let's talk about this natural selection. It's not all about being the strongest and the fastest. How about cryptic? That's a robber fly. Looks like a bumblebee. Completely different orders of insects, but that robber fly has evolved to look like a bee, so its prey will ignore it. So the idea here is that life and death and reproduction are not random. There's variation within these populations. Some individuals are more likely to survive, and if you're more likely to survive, you'll reproduce and pass on your set of genes to the next generation. And then over time, these favorable traits accumulate and the population evolves. Notice I said population, not individual. So if you're a fly, a predatory fly, and the more you look like a bee, the more likely you are to get a meal. So there it is. That's natural selection. That's the mechanism of evolution. Now let's go back In my previous video, I talked about how we stand on the shoulders of giants, that nobody works in a vacuum. So Darwin realized that evolution was slow. I mean, yes, you could have evolution in a generation. We can see evolution happening in a lab. In fact, we can actually observe pretty big changes in a lab in somebody's career. But how about like the macro evolution? Large animal groups like the evolution of mammals that take place over tens of millions of years. How do you go from, like a fish to us? Yes, we evolved from fish. Well, not directly, but 375 million years ago, our ancestors were a fish. Well, Darwin realized the earth was old. This is Lyell's influence, right? Lyell he realized the earth is old because he was studying the rates of what geological processes were occurring today, or at least in 1800s, and he realized that these processes are slow. This is the old earth hypothesis. Actually, we know the earth is 4.6 billion years old. That's another thing I'll talk about later. But with the earth being very old, not young, there was enough time for these species to slowly change over millions of years. And for example, this is me at Monument Valley in 2008. I know. And those rocks between my hands right there are 270 million years old. They date all the way back to the Permian, and they predate the dinosaurs. They were before the end Permian extinction. Malthus was another influence. Malthus came up with the idea of exponential population growth. He said, hey, any population can grow exponentially. But we're not run over by frogs. Hardly any of these tadpoles, or these are actually the eggs, they'll be tadpoles pretty shortly after this photo, most of them will die. Not every individual born will survive. So over large scales, I mean, you can have randomness. I mean, there could be a mudslide, or this just dries out and they all die. But over large scales, this randomness gets kind of washed out, and it's not totally random. There is variation within that population, and any individual that is best fit to the environment, more likely to reproduce, pass on those genes, you accumulate traits. Now, of course, I have not got into sexual selection, which is a bit different. We'll talk about that later. And of course, Linnaeus. Linnaeus classified organisms based on similarities. If they were very close related to each other, or if they all the same species, they were named species. If they were less closely related to each other, they may be in the same family. So this idea of descent with modification coming from common ancestry fit fairly nicely in with Linnaeus's classification system. So for example, here's two rosy finches. This is a black rosy finch and a Hepburn's rosy finch. Do they look similar? Yeah, they probably are. They're very similar. I don't think Hepburn's is actually a legitimate species, but it should be. But it's not a black rosy finch. It's another kind. But the point here is they look similar. And the reason why is because they probably separated out during the last ice age within the last million or so years. So that's not very long. Now let's go way back. Here's a rosy finch. This is a bird. This is a type of coral. It's an animal. And these are both animals, right? We're multicellular organisms. We have we have muscles coordinated by a nervous system. We feed by ingestion. We have true germ layers and symmetry. Yeah, we have Hox genes. So that's an animal down there. I know it's really weird looking, but we haven't shared a common ancestor with a cnidarian, which is what a coral is, in over 600 million years. So there's been a long time of evolutionary history allowing for these divergences to happen. So there you go. So let's think about this. Here are these katydid tropics. They all look like leaves, but these are all different species. And they all kind of converged, but not quite converged, on looking like leaves to avoid predation. So here it is. Species change over time. Fact. They change over time due to natural selection. Natural selection is the mechanism of evolution. It explains how evolution occurs. That's the theory. So there are more individuals born that can survive. And there's variation among those individuals. Those variations are heritable. That's important because that was not known how you got these traits and this genetic variation in a population back in those days. And then life and death are not, did I say ransom? Random. Misspelled my word down there. Well, the D and the S keys are right next to each other. But the life and death are not random. The best fit are most likely to survive and reproduce. And then you pass those traits on, and then over time, these favorable traits accumulate. You look more and more like a green leaf. You look more and more like a rotted leaf. And no, those wings are intact. That's how they look. They're not beat up or rotten. They've evolved to look like a rotting leaf. So over time, these changes accumulate, and you have the evolution, species changing over time. Okay, so there you have it. There's Darwin's contributions, right? We talk about this evolution by natural selection, which is the mechanism of how species change over time. But don't forget this incredibly important concept that we evolved from common ancestry, and that explains the unity and diversity in life. And we can see the unity right here. These are all katydids. And you can see the diversity that they all evolved in their different way to look like a leaf to avoid predation. All right, until next time, I'm your host, Dr. Tom Kennedy, and this has been Tom Kennedy's Science.